One of the most important mountains in the Bible is the Mount of Olives. And it helps us to understand the Bible if we understand something about the Mount of Olives. And one thing we've got to get is that the Mount of Olives is really close to Jerusalem. It's literally, the Mount of Olives is just a bow shot away. The Kidron Valley, which is right in front of you, is very steep and a V-shaped valley. So it just drops right down to the bottom of the valley, and then back up is the west slope of the Mount of Olives. And a lot of important biblical events occurred on the Mount of Olives or are associated with the Mount of Olives. The first time we read about the Mount of Olives in the Bible is when David was leaving Jerusalem and fleeing from Absalom, and he's going to flee east. So he would have left his area of the palace of Jerusalem, gone down into the Kidron Valley, come back up, and the Bible says when he reached the top of the Mount of Olives, he offered a sacrifice to Yahweh, and then kept going down to the east, down towards the Dead Sea and across the Jordan River into Moab. Another thing we learn is that when Jesus Christ was making his final approach to Jerusalem, he's coming from Jericho, and Jericho is way down on the east side, and Christ would have made the climb up from Jericho. And the Bible tells us that as Jesus Christ came over the top of the Mount of Olives and got this beautiful panoramic look at Jerusalem from his position in the east, looking west, it says he wept, or a better translation, he burst into tears.
We are beginning a descent down the western slope of the Mount of Olives in what modern-day pilgrims coming to Jerusalem would call the Palm Sunday walk. It's called that because in church tradition, Jesus made the descent down the western face of the Mount of Olives, across the brook Kidron, the Kidron Valley, and then up to the temple to teach. A better term for this event is really called the triumphal entry. Now, why would you call it a triumph when Jesus is descending to teach into the temple the last couple days of his life, knowing that he is going to be arrested, tortured, and crucified? It's a triumph because this event, and he was riding on a donkey, marked the fulfillment of a very important prophecy in the book of Zechariah, chapter 9, verse 9, where the king would arrive to Jerusalem, humble and meek, on a donkey, and he would go into the temple. And people would recognize that if they knew Zechariah's prophecy, would recognize Jesus entering as king.
Now we're looking at Jerusalem from the south side, and the wall that heads to the right side is the east wall of Jerusalem. And then you see a very deep, steep valley right on the right side of the picture, and that is the Kidron Valley. And so the Kidron Valley goes steeply toward the east from Jerusalem and then hits the Mount of Olives. Down there toward the bottom of the Mount of Olives, as we near the Kidron Valley, would be the Garden of Gethsemane.
We're walking down the Mount of Olives. We're walking down from the top of the Mount of Olives down the west slope toward Jerusalem. And we're heading toward the Garden of Gethsemane, the traditional Garden of Gethsemane, which it may not be the actual site. We don't know where the actual site of the garden was, but it's close.
So when you're reading the Gospels and it says that Christ left Jerusalem and crossed the Kidron, he's walking down that steep slope from Jerusalem, and then he's going to enter the Garden of Gethsemane down toward the bottom of the west bank of the Mount of Olives. Jesus Christ prayed there very close to Jerusalem, and we know that for not only the geography, but then when Jesus Christ was in the Garden of Gethsemane and about to be arrested, he and his apostles could look up to the west, and coming down that steep slope from Jerusalem, they could see the torches of the soldiers and Jewish leaders who were coming to arrest Christ.
And we believe that the historical and archaeological evidence points to the fact that Jesus was crucified on top of the Mount of Olives. It was by a very important road, both east and west and north and south. It was close to the temple area. And very importantly, the people on top of the temple area could see the curtain of the temple get torn.
Then we also know that Jesus Christ ascended into heaven from the east slope of the Mount of Olives around Bethany. And also, because we know that the peak of the Mount of Olives ran east and west, Zechariah foretold that when the Messiah returns and he's going to fight the Battle of Armageddon,
he will come north and his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, and the Mount of Olives will split. And this half of the Mount of Olives will move south, and that half of the Mount of Olives will move north, and Mount Zion, which is where the temple is, will be raised up.
And that's going to open a valley up. So now people are going to be standing in the temple, and instead of looking east and seeing the Mount of Olives, they're going to look east, and here's this big valley now, and they can see out to the Dead Sea area. So lots and lots of interesting things happening in and around the Mount of Olives. It's just an amazing place and a very important biblical site.